In-depth coverage of the top stories and breaking news when it happens. News Radio 1080 KRLD.
We're joined on the KRLD Newsline by Dr. Alex Del Carmen from Tarleton State University and the Texas A&M University System. There's a new report looking into racial profiling in Texas, and this is very detailed, very intricate, and we're happy to be joined by Dr. Del Carmen to break it down. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks for allowing me to join you.
Absolutely. So tell us what inspires this report, and before we get into the insights, what you hope to glean from it.
Essentially, about a year and a half ago, the Texas A&M system came together and asked several of us academics to put together a committee. That committee had in mind to have some sort of you want to call it a contribution towards law enforcement. And as a result of that committee, we founded what is called IPAC, IPAC. That is the Institute for Predictive Analytics in Criminal Justice. And it is based out of Tarleton State University in Fort Worth. And so what we do is a group of academics from all 12 universities that are part of A&M system. And we basically go through data at the state level. And this is one of those reports that we've been working for a few months to let folks around the state know what it looks like across the state as it relates to motor vehicle stops, specifically based on race and ethnicity.
And there are some interesting insights here, but one of the top insights is that Hispanics were most likely to be stopped for law violations. Tell us what we found.
Essentially, what is important about this report is that this is the first time since the Sandra Bland law was passed in 2017, and really the first time since the racial profiling law was passed in 2001, that we have enough data at the granular level that we can actually make something out of it, right? So that's a really important factor to keep in mind, because many of the findings that we come up with in the study are really first-time findings. And one of them, as you noted, is the fact that Hispanics accounted for the most significant percentage of individuals that were stopped, and also the most significant percentage of individuals that were searched. And that in itself is incredibly insightful, particularly when we look at the end results of that search, meaning that they were not the ones that accounted for the most contraband found as a result of searches.
How is this type of information going to help law enforcement and those looking into law enforcement?
So I think the most important thing that this study does is it brings into question why it is that Hispanics are being searched at such a high rate in spite of the fact that contraband is not being found. To me, that I've studied this topic for 25 years across the United States, and I work with many law enforcement agencies in the state of Texas and across the U.S., I can tell you that what is most significant about this is that it raises all sorts of questions as to why it is that Hispanics are being subject to these searches, some of which are what we call discretionary searches. In other words, the officer had the discretion to search the vehicle or the person, but yet contraband was not found. So what this study does is it really provokes that question for us to do a deep dive and find out what those reasons were, which is what we're working on right now, right? So we are now looking into that level of data at the granular level, and we hope that in a month or so, we're going to have more information that can relay details as to why this particular factor is in place.
Interesting as well that whites were most likely to be stopped for moving traffic violations and also more likely to be stopped for vehicle traffic violations. I don't know if we can read any more of that at this point, but just something to think about. And also, there has, over the last several years, been a lot of concern when it comes to physical force during police interactions. What were some of the things found when it came to physical force and the use of it?
The first component of whites, it really is not surprising that whites were stopped the most, given the volume of Caucasians that live in the state of Texas, right? But putting that aside, I think one of the things that is interesting is that whites had the highest level of contraband hit rate as it relates to the searches that resulted in contraband being found. So in other words, it seems to be that the quote unquote white searches were legitimate in the sense that contraband was found as a result of that. As it relates to use of force, the Sandra Bland law requires for every agency in the state to report any time an officer stops somebody, and as a result of that stop, engages in use of force that results in bodily injury. And bodily injury, we define it in the Texas Code as any time the person either complains or is in fact hurt as a result of that use of force. And what we found in this study is that less than 1% of all the stops that were made across the state of Texas involved use of physical force, and that force was in fact resulted in bodily injury.
I will ask before we move on, what kind of, not just raw data as you say, but did you do any kind of per capita breakdown when it came to the racial makeup of those who are getting pulled over?
The problem with doing that, John, is that for years, I know that the media in general has focused on how many Hispanics, blacks, or whites a particular police agency stops a year, and then automatically, almost instinctively, they compare that percentage to census data. The problem with that is that there are many cities in the state of Texas. In fact, I would argue a majority of jurisdictions in the state of Texas where the officers are in fact pulling people over that don't live in that particular jurisdiction. Not only is it a significant percentage, but in some cases is the majority of those individuals that are in fact non-city residents. And so if you compare that number to the number of stops to the number of people that live in that jurisdiction, you are in fact comparing apples and oranges. And that's why we have to look further than who gets stopped, and we have to look at what happens once the stop is made, right? So is there a search that takes place? And then as a result of that search, is contraband being found, which is the ultimate vindication for any individual that says, gee, that search was not justified. Well, did you find something as a result of that? And if you did, then it could in fact be good police work, right? That the officer is in fact pulling somebody over because that officer has probable cause and engaged in that search because of the legal constitutional requirement that officer has already met. That's why those searches are so important, and particularly the outcome of the searches versus necessarily who gets stopped.
And you've got me on the edge of my seat because this is just the tip of the iceberg. As you mentioned, this is some of the raw data. Now you're going to go down more granularly, and that should give us a deeper insight into these numbers.
Exactly. And I think data can only explain partially what the reality is, but we also know that data has an insight, right? So I always equate it to a medical doctor, gauging your temperature, right? Just because you may have a slight, high fever, or because you may have a high fever, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're suffering from terminal illness. So at the end of the day, it gives us a partial view, but it does give us a partial view that would allow police agencies across the state to compare themselves to other jurisdictions in the state. And hopefully the chiefs of police, the city managers, the city councils are going to start asking questions that are good questions as to what exactly is going on in our police department. Are there issues that we are facing? And if not, then great, right? If the data suggests that things are just wonderful, so be it. But if it does suggest that there may be some problems, then you have to start digging in and doing all of these deep dives to find out whether or not that problem is at the individual level, or if in fact there are a group of officers that may be engaging in racial profiling. And obviously the hope is to deal with it, to address it immediately so that practice is simply not acceptable or something that we do in Texas.
Absolutely. I cannot wait to hear more as more comes out. Anything else that I haven't led you to that you wanted to add?
One thing that I'll tell you is that this institute, I founded it last year, and it was really the direct result of the George Floyd death, when many of us came together as per being called by the leadership of A&M System to do this. It is really the first institute of its kind, because it is a system institute, but yet at the same time it resides in one of the system universities, in this case Tarleton. And I'm just grateful to the support that we have received, both from the president at Tarleton as well as from the chancellor's office at the A&M System, that has allowed us to have some seed funding to be able to do this kind of research. So we're very excited about it, and we hope to continue to make a contribution in the years to come.